My name is Julian, though in the circle of the chosen they called me the Blinder. I didn't choose this path out of adolescent curiosity or rebellion. I was an offering before I even had the use of reason. My parents, members of a hermetic sect that operated in the shadows of high society, gave me away in a consecration ritual when I was barely 7 years old. I remember the coldness of the marble, the pungent smell of incense mixed with goat's blood, and the chants in a language that made my ears ring. That night my childhood died, and in its place was born an instrument designed for darkness. I grew up under the tutelage of the master, a man whose age no one knew and whose gaze seemed like 2 pools of cold ash. He taught me that the physical world is just a shell and that true power lies in pacts. My education didn't consist of mathematics or history, but rather the study of the frequencies of pain, the geometry of altars, and the law of exchange. Nothing is given away for free in the abyss. Julian would repeat this to me as he forced me to hold daggers over live animals. For something to rise, something must fall. For a powerful person to be cleansed of their guilt, a life must be given in their place. By the age of 20, I was already the chief executor. My specialty was reverse atonement rituals. Politicians, businessmen, and high-flying criminals came to us burdened with atrocious crimes. I performed the sacrifice on their behalf, transferring their stain to an animal or, on darker occasions, to objects that were then buried in cemeteries under protective seals. My life was a succession of moonless nights, damp earth under my fingernails, and a heaviness that became my natural state. What people don't understand about elite Satanism is that it's not a caricature from movies, it's a bureaucratic and spiritual machine of terrifying precision. I felt a cold euphoria every time I finished a job. Seeing a powerful man tremble before me and then walk away with a clean conscience, believing himself free of his sin because I had shed blood for him, gave me an almost divine sense of superiority. I was the gatekeeper of hell, the one who decided who entered and who could buy another day of false peace. But the price of being the gatekeeper was the absolute loss of my own humanity. I could no longer feel warmth, hunger, or love. I lived in a luxurious apartment that felt like a tomb. The entities we summoned weren't my friends, they were business partners who demanded a constant tribute of my own life force. My hands were always cold, and my reflection in the mirror began to distort. Sometimes I saw shadows moving behind me, even in broad daylight. They were my debt collectors, reminding me that I, too, was property of the sect. The crack in my reality began one October night. We were ordered to do a different job. It wasn't to clean up a criminal, but to silence a disturbance. In a poor neighborhood of the city, a small Christian church, a humble, unfinished brick structure, was causing trouble. Its prayers were affecting the operations of one of our most important benefactors, a man who trafficked in people's desperation. The master called me to his study, a place where the air was always 10 degrees cooler than in the rest of the house. "There will be no lamb's blood tonight," Julian said, stroking an obsidian dagger. "Tonight you will carry the seal of devastation to the threshold of that temple. You must bury it beneath the pulpit. Those people believe their faith protects them, but we will show them that our darkness is older and hungrier." I took the object, a small lead box wrapped in human leather, and felt a jolt of pure hatred course up my arm. It wasn't my hatred, it was the hatred of the entity contained in the box. I prepared myself as always, black robes, ritual oils, and the protective mantra that made me invisible to the curious. For me, it was just another job. I had desecrated much larger places and faced far more dangerous men. What could a handful of poor people singing ancient hymns do to me? I drove to the outlying neighborhood. The streets were full of potholes, and the smell of garbage was overwhelming. As I got out of the car, I felt a resistance in the air that I had never experienced before. It was like walking against an invisible current. My guardian spirits, the shadows that always accompanied me, began to stir. I heard warning whispers in my mind, sounds of fear and growls that denoted fear. Fear, I wondered incredulously. I didn't know fear, and my masters knew it even less. I approached the small church. Through the single-pane windows, music drifted. It wasn't the mathematical frequencies of the abyss, but a discordant yet vibrant choir. The lyrics spoke of blood that no longer demanded sacrifices. Blood that had already been spilled once and for all. This struck me as blasphemy against my own logic of exchange. I reached the front door, lead box in hand, ready to enter and plant the seed of destruction, but as I placed my hand on the wooden doorknob, something happened. It wasn't an electric shock or a physical force, it was a weight of glory, an atmosphere so dense and pure that my knees buckled instantly. My shadows, my protectors, let out a collective shriek in my head and fled, leaving me utterly alone before that door. For the first time in my 20 years as a Reaper, I felt a terror that paralyzed my lungs. The lead box began to burn in my hand as if it were made of glowing coal. I looked toward the door and saw that through the cracks in the wood came a light that was not of this world. It wasn't electric light, it was something alive, something that knew me, something that was looking directly at the monster they had turned me into. The portal I represented met the portal of truth, and in that collision, I understood that all my power was just a cheap shadow compared to what dwelled in that humble brick temple. The weight, the glory emanating from that small temple kept me glued to the ground, my forehead pressed against the cracked cement of the sidewalk. The lead box, the seal of devastation that was supposed to curse that place. Now it was an unbearable piece of fire in my right hand. I felt my fingers burning, but I couldn't let go. The pact that bound me to that object was so deep that my flesh and the lead seemed one. "Enter," roared the master's voice in my mind, but his tone was no longer one of authority, but of hysterical desperation. "Enter and plant the seal. Darkness cannot be stopped by brick walls." But it wasn't the walls that stopped me, it was the atmosphere. In my life as a Cordillo, I had entered immense cathedrals, ancient temples, and temples of great power, and in all those places I always felt that the darkness could walk freely, mocking the empty rituals of men. But here, in this neighborhood church, without adornments or luxuries, there was something that wasn't a ritual. There was a presence, it was a density that made the oxygen feel different. An air that didn't allow lies to breathe. My protectors, those shadows that had accompanied me since I was 7 years old, had vanished. For the first time in my adult life, I experienced the absolute silence of spiritual solitude. Without them, I felt naked, vulnerable, and ridiculously small. The choir inside the church began to sing louder. They weren't professional voices, some were out of tune and others tired from the day's work, but they emitted a frequency that made the seal on my hand vibrate until it almost burst. "There is power, unparalleled power, in the blood that the Lord shed," they sang upon hearing the word blood. My training kicked in instinctively. In my world, blood was the payment, the sacrifice, the pain necessary to obtain a favor, but they sang of blood that had already been spilled. Blood that didn't demand more victims, but offered freedom. That idea struck my mind like a sledgehammer. If that blood was real, then all my work as a Reaper, all the slaughtered animals, and all the atonement rituals I had performed were an unnecessary farce. The system of exchange on which I based my existence was crumbling before a simple song, fighting against the pressure that tried to crush me. I managed to stand. Curiosity and hatred mingled in my gut. I had to see who these warriors were who were defeating my entities without even knowing I was outside. I pushed open the wooden door. I expected to find an army of intercessors or at least a group of people performing a complex defensive ritual. What I saw left me speechless. There were about 30 people, a man in work clothes, an old woman with a simple veil, a group of young people with cheap guitars, and children sitting on the floor. They didn't look at me with fear. In fact, hardly anyone noticed my entrance. At first, they were absorbed, hands raised and eyes closed, talking to someone who wasn't physically there but who filled every inch of the room. The man in the pulpit, a man in his 50s with the calloused hands of a laborer, stopped and fixed his gaze on me. He didn't look at me as an enemy. He looked at me with such deep pity that it hurt more than a blow. At that moment, the lead box in my hand emitted an audible hiss. Black, fetid smoke began to pour from it, filling the air with the smell of sulfur and decay. "Son," said the man in the pulpit, his voice unwavering, you've brought a burden that doesn't belong to you. That object you hold isn't power, it's your own death warrant. But in this house, the Lion of the tribe of Judah reigns, and here, chains are broken." The congregation stopped singing. The silence became so thick that I could hear my own sweat dripping onto the floor. My shadows returned suddenly, but not to protect me, but to reclaim me. I felt invisible hands encircle my neck, squeezing, punishing me for allowing the light to touch the seal. I began to suffocate, my eyes rolled back, and I fell to my knees again, finally releasing the lead box that rolled down the central aisle, leaving a trail of black ash. "In the name of Jesus!" the pastor shouted, extending his hand toward me. That name was like a dynamite blast in the spiritual realm. I saw with the vision that the occult had given me how a golden shockwave swept through the room. The shadows that were strangling me were ripped from my body with such violence that I let out an inhuman shriek, a voice that wasn't my own. The lead box exploded into pieces and the object containing a human bone carved with curses turned to fine dust before my eyes. I collapsed face down, gasping, feeling that something that had been attached to my soul since I was 7 years old had just been ripped out by the roots. The emptiness I felt was terrifying, but for the first time in my life I didn't feel cold. I felt a strange warmth that started in my chest and spread to my hands. The pastor approached me and placed his hand on my back. There were no strange rituals, no dark chants, just a simple prayer. "Lord, rescue this blind man who has encountered the truth. Break the blood pact of your lineage and wash it clean with the blood that truly has power." At that moment I lost consciousness, but before the darkness claimed me, I heard a voice that was neither the pastor's nor the teacher's. It was a voice that sounded like many waters, an authority that made the entire universe fall into place. "Today the reaper becomes the harvest." I awoke on the wooden floor of the church, but I was not the same man who had entered with a lead box hours before. The air in my lungs felt strangely light, as if a vest of stones I had carried for 2 decades had been lifted from my body. However, the relief was short-lived. As I tried to sit up, a searing pain shot through my right forearm. I looked at my skin and let out a scream of pure horror. The tattoo of the sect's seal, a mark etched with ritual ink on my skin since adolescence, was oozing a black, viscous liquid that burned like acid. "The pact is trying to claim you, Julian," said the pastor, who had stayed by my side while the other church members prayed in circles around me. "When you turn your back on the abyss tries to break you so you can't tell what you saw." I didn't have time to answer. At that moment, the panes of the upper windows of the church shattered inward, not from the wind, but from a shockwave of pure hatred. The smell of sulfur, which had been a trace before, became a suffocating cloud. Outside, the sky above the neighborhood had turned an unnatural purple. I knew what it meant. The master wasn't going to wait for me to return to give explanations. They had detected the destruction of the seal and had sent the trackers low-ranking entities, but of brutal physical violence, designed to tear the traitors apart. "You have to get out of here," I shouted, trying to stand up. "If they stay, they'll die because of me. They're not coming for the temple, they're coming for my head. The contract says my life belongs to them down to the last drop of my blood." The pastor grabbed my shoulders with a strength that seemed inhuman. His eyes shone with a determination that silenced me. "Listen to me carefully, boy. This house isn't just bricks, it's conquered territory. They can roar outside, but if you decide that your life now belongs to Christ, they have no legal authority to touch you. But you have to renounce it, with your mouth, with your will." Now, as he spoke, the main doors of the church began to bow inward, as if a giant were striking them with an invisible sledgehammer. A collective hissing, like that of thousands of snakes, surrounded the building. I began to hear the voices of my ancestors, the reapers who came before me, shouting at me from the void, "Traitor! Blood demands blood. Return to the altar or you will be the sacrifice." The pain in my arm became unbearable. I saw my veins begin to turn black, spreading toward my neck. It was a remote execution. The master was performing the revocation ritual at the sect's headquarters, using my own DNA to shut down my heart. "I renounce," I screamed, falling to my knees. Sweat blurred my vision. "I renounce the blood pact. I renounce my parents' heritage. I renounce the name of Reaper." At that moment, the church door split in two. But what entered was not a man, It was a gust of solid shadows that knocked over the wooden pews as if they were toys. The temperature dropped so low that my breath turned to frost. In the center from the black mist I saw the silhouette of what we called an executioner, a 3-meter-tall faceless entity, armed with iron hooks that dripped a substance that corroded the ground. "Julian," the executioner's voice vibrated in my ears, a frequency that made my teeth chatter. "The master demands his tithe. Come with us or we will drag every soul in this place into the swamp with you." Fear paralyzed me. I felt my old nature, the one that reveled in the power of death, trying to resurface to save me. "Just go back to them," my instinct whispered. "Go back and you will be powerful again." But the pastor stepped between the shadow and me. He had no weapons, no armor, he only held an old Bible and raised his right hand. "It is written that the Son of God appeared to undo the works of the dead." His voice was not a shout, it was a decree that made the shadows receded. "This soul is no longer in your book. We bear the mark of the blood that is stronger than your death pacts." What I saw next defies any physical logic I learned in the sect. A column of white light, so intense that it blinded me for a few seconds, descended from the church ceiling. It wasn't lamplight, it was an energy that felt like pure fire, but didn't burn the skin. When the light touched the executioner, the entity let out a shriek that shattered the remaining windows in the neighborhood. The shadow dissolved like burnt paper in front of a fan. The silence that followed was absolute. The sky outside regained its normal city-night darkness. My arm stopped burning. I looked at my forearm and let out a sigh of relief. Where the seal tattoo had been, there was now only a smooth scar, as if it had never existed. The physical link was broken. I collapsed to the ground. Trembling, I was alive, but I knew that this was only the beginning. The master wouldn't stop. I knew too many secrets, too many names, too many locations. I had been the custodian of his sacrifices, and now I was his greatest threat. "This isn't over, is it?" I asked the pastor as he helped me to my feet. "No, Julian, you have just declared war on hell, but there is a difference. Before, you fought for a master who hated you, now the army of heaven fights for you. But you have to get out of here. If you stay in one place, you will endanger many. You have to go to the source. You have to destroy the altars you yourself helped to build." I looked at my hands. They were no longer cold. For the first time in 27 years, I felt the warmth of my own blood surging through my veins. I was no longer a sacrificer, I was a fugitive from the shadows, a man with a target on his back, but with a light in his chest that no darkness could extinguish. The true battle for my soul had just entered the next phase, the demolition of the empire that saw me born. Freedom is a terrifying concept, when you've spent your entire life chained to an altar. I left the church under the protection of a group of brothers who escorted me to a beat-up vehicle. We couldn't use my car, it had tracking devices hidden in the chassis, link seals that would allow the master's trackers to find me in any corner of the city by the simple trail of my body heat. The pastor handed me a backpack with old clothes, some money, and a warning that was etched in my memory. "Don't trust your senses, Julian, the enemy will now speak to you through memory." I took refuge in a roadside motel on the outskirts of town, a place where the smell of cigarettes and dampness was thick enough to camouflage, at least humanly, my trail. But the spiritual world knows nothing of concrete walls. That first night, reality began to crack. As soon as I closed my eyes, the sound of ritual drums began to reverberate through the room's floor. It wasn't a physical sound, but a vibration in my bones. The master was summoning the Circle of Seven, the sect's elite, to perform the rite of the lost shadow in high-ranking occultism. When a blood initiate deserts, the sect performs a sacrifice to reclaim the traitor's shadow. If they succeed, your body remains alive, but your will becomes a puppet. You begin to feel an unbearable emptiness, a depression that drives you to suicide or to crawl back to the altar. "Julian," the voice of my mother, dead for 5 years, whispered from the dark corner of the room. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding against my ribs. I knew it wasn't her. My mother had been a high priestess consumed by the very power she tried to bequeath to me, but the voice was identical, with that hint of false sweetness she used before every sacrifice. "Julian, "Look what you've done," the apparition said, materializing as a grey mist before the door. "You have broken the lineage. The abyss is thirsty, and since you are not on the altar, they will come for the blood of the innocent. Do you remember the pastor's daughter? The girl who looked at you curiously in the church, her name is already written on the dagger." An icy chill ran down my spine. Emotional blackmail is the darkness's favorite tool. I knew the master wouldn't hesitate to attack those who had helped me. If I hid, they would pay the price. Guilt, that old acquaintance, began to tighten around my throat like a hemp rope. "It's your fault," my mind said. "If you go back, they'll be safe." But then I remembered the pillar of light in the church. I remembered that light not only protected me, but disintegrated the executioner. I closed my eyes tightly and for the first time tried to use the weapon the pastor had taught me. They weren't magic words, not a mantra of control, it was a declaration of ownership. "I am not yours," I whispered, my voice trembling. "I'm not of the lineage of the dagger. I have been bought by blood you cannot touch. Get out of here, spirit of lies." The grey mist let out a shriek that made the television in the room flicker on with pure static. My mother's image distorted, revealing for a second the face of a skeletal figure before vanishing. Silence returned, but not peace. I understood I couldn't keep running. If I wanted the church people to be safe, I had to strike at the serpent's heart. I had to return to the Quinta, the sect's headquarters. In the cellars of that mansion lay the Book of Shadows, a leather record where the names of all of us who had been consecrated since birth were written. My name was there, written in my own newborn blood. As long as that record existed, they would have a legal claim on my soul. But entering was a suicide mission. The Quinta was guarded by threshold guardians, entities that tore apart anyone who didn't bear the active mark of the seal, and I no longer had it. I stood up and looked at myself in the mirror. My face looked different. The deathly pallor that had been with me for years was fading, replaced by a more vibrant tone, but my eyes reflected the weariness of a war that had only just begun. In the pastor's backpack, I found a small Bible, and a water bottle they had prayed over. It seemed ridiculous to compare that to the obsidian daggers and grimoires of power I used to wield, but then I remembered that the sect's power was based on fear and hierarchy, while the power that rescued me was based on the authority of a name. I left the motel in the pouring rain. I didn't have a perfect plan, but I had a direction. I drove a stolen car toward the most exclusive part of town, where the mansions were hidden behind stone walls and security cameras. As I approached the estate, the atmosphere grew oppressive. Stray dogs fled the area, and the birds fell silent. The mansion stood like a monument to sin, its dark windows like watchful eyes. Reaching the perimeter wall, I felt the first barrier, a wall of negative energy that made you feel nauseous and filled you with a deep sadness, designed to keep the curious away. Before, I would cross this without feeling a thing. Now it was like walking into a fire. "Lord," I said, clutching the small Bible to my chest, "you pulled me out of the pit. Don't let me fall back in. Give me the authority to go in and destroy what binds me." Suddenly, something happened that I had never seen in all my years of occultism. My hands began to glow with a soft warmth, a white light that seemed to emanate from my pores. As I touched the stone wall, the alarm seal that should have been activated by my presence simply shut off. It wasn't a hack, it was an override of authority. The darkness recognized a higher presence that forced it back. I leapt over the wall and landed in the perfectly manicured garden. The silence was terrifying. But then the lights of the mansion all came on at once. The front door swung open, revealing the master standing in the doorway, dressed in his red ritual robes, surrounded by 6 hooded figures. His hands held the Book of Shadows. "We were waiting for you, blinding one," said his voice, amplified by the shadows writhing at his feet. "You have come to offer yourself for the final sacrifice. No one escapes the living circle, and today your blood will write the chapter of your own burial." I looked around. Skeletal hands began to emerge from the garden floor, remnants of the hundreds of sacrifices that had been performed there over the decades. I was surrounded. The intensity of the hatred emanating from the house was enough to stop the heart of an ordinary man, but I was no longer an ordinary man. I was a man on a mission of spiritual demolition. The air in the garden of the estate became so thick that each breath burned my lungs as if I were inhaling ash. The master stood motionless in the doorway, the Book of Shadows open in his pale hands. Around him, the 6 members of the circle began to chant a monophonic song, a low frequency that made the ground vibrate and the gravestones hidden beneath the perfect lawn begin to crack. I was alone, disarmed according to the logic of this world, facing the power structure that had molded me since childhood. "Look at yourself, Julian," the master hissed, his voice seeming to come from all directions at once. "You have brought a paper book and a beggar's faith to a place where the ancient gods demand their tithe. Do you really think your new light can survive in the belly of the beast that fed you?" The hooded figures stepped forward in unison. From their robes elongated shadows began to sprout, claws of physical darkness that crawled across the ground toward my feet. I felt a primal fear, a chill that screamed at me to turn and run, but I knew that if I turned my back now, my soul would be married before I reached the wall. I reached into my backpack and clutched the small Bible. It wasn't an amulet, but the touch of it reminded me that my authority no longer depended on my physical strength or my years of occult training. "The contract is broken," I said, and I was surprised by the firmness of my own voice. "I am no longer the blinder, no longer your instrument. I have come for what is mine, my name and my freedom." The master let out a dry laugh that sounded like bones breaking. With a swift movement, he tore a page from the book, my page, written with my newborn blood, and held it over a blue flame that sprang from nowhere in the palm of his hand. The instant the fire licked the parchment, I felt a searing pain in my chest, as if an invisible hand were squeezing my heart. Trying to stop it, I fell to my knees, gasping, as my vision filled with red blurs. "If you are not ours, you will be no one's," he decreed. "Your life is written here, and I am the one who closes the book." The members of the circle rushed at me. They didn't walk. They slid with unnatural speed. One of them reached me and struck me with a force that sent me flying against a marble statue. I tasted the metallic tang of blood in my mouth. I was being crushed by the very force I had helped to strengthen for years in my agony. As shadows began to encircle me, dragging me toward the mansion's cellars, I remembered something the pastor had whispered to me before I left. "Darkness does not retreat before religion." Julian, I recoiled from identity. I closed my eyes, ignoring the ache in my failing heart, and focused on the only truth I had left. I wasn't a former Satanist trying to survive. I was a child of God under attack. "Stop!" I shouted, slamming my right hand on the ground. It wasn't a cry of despair, but a command of authority. In that microsecond, the white light I had felt in the church erupted from within me again, but this time it was more intense, more aggressive. A shockwave of absolute purity surged from my body, striking the members of the circle. The hooded figures recoiled with cries of pain as their shadows evaporated upon contact with the light. The pressure in my chest vanished instantly. The blue flame in the master's hand went out, leaving the page of my contract intact, but charred. I stood with a strength that wasn't my own. The master took a step back, and for the first time in my life, a crack appeared in his mask of invulnerability. Fear. His ashen eyes opened in disbelief. "How is this possible?" he stammered. "This land is consecrated to the Seven. Here, the light has no jurisdiction. All authority has been given to the one I serve," I replied, walking toward him. "And in his name, this place of sacrifice is invalidated." I entered the mansion, crossing the threshold that was once my home and my prison. The interior was stifling, filled with grotesque statues and the echo of thousands of wails trapped within the walls. I headed straight for the staircase that descended to the sanctuary of bones, the cellar where the records and blood idols were kept. The master tried to stop me by summoning a barrier of solid blackness in the hallway, but it was enough for me to extend my hand for the darkness to split like an old cloth. Upon reaching the basement, the horror was absolute. The walls were lined with the remains of decades of sacrifices. In the center, upon an obsidian altar, rested the main idol, an amorphous figure made of metal amalgams and biological remains that seemed to throb with a malevolent life. Therein lay the source of the sect's power in this city. "If you touch that, you will die," whispered the master, still trembling. "The energy contained there is enough to incinerate your soul." I looked at the altar and then at the small bottle of water the pastor had given me. It seemed an insignificant weapon against centuries of accumulated evil, but the pastor had told me that the water was only a symbol. What mattered was the faith of those who had prayed. I uncorked the bottle and with a firm motion poured the contents onto the obsidian altar while pronouncing the name above all names. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic for the mansion. There was no explosion of fire, but a burst of light that seemed to dissolve matter itself. The idol began to crack, letting out a deafening shriek that shook the foundations of the manor. The basement walls began to crumble, and the names written in the Book of Shadows began to run like ink in water. The master fell to the floor, covering his face as his appearance began to change drastically without the support of the altar's entity. His artificial youth vanished in seconds, revealing a decrepit and terrified old man. The entire mansion was being purged. I took the book, which now it was just old leather, blank pages, and I left the basement as debris fell around me. The estate, the monument to the darkness that had ruled my life, was sinking into its own emptiness. Stepping out into the garden, the purple sky had vanished, giving way to a clean rain that washed the ash from my skin. I had destroyed the legal record of my enslavement, but I knew the evil empire had many more headquarters. The war was only just changing in scale. The crash of the estate collapsing behind me was a sound I had expected to hear all my life, though I never thought I would be the one to cause it. The early morning air, once saturated with the static of evil, now felt cold and sharp. In my hands, the Book of Shadows no longer had any weight. It was a dead object, a leather corpse whose blank pages fluttered in the wind. Yet there was no time to celebrate. As I crossed the threshold of the perimeter wall, I felt a violent pull in my spirit, a pang of anguish that didn't belong to me. In the occult, there's a bond called blood resonance. When a main altar is destroyed, the residual energy desperately seeks a new vessel or lashes out against what the deserter loves most. "The church," I whispered, and panic gave me back the strength that exhaustion was stealing. I drove the stolen car at suicidal speed, dodging the shadows that still seemed to dance in the periphery of my vision. My mind was a whirlwind of images. I knew that the master, though decrepit, wasn't the only power in that hierarchy. The sect had branches, nodes of power distributed throughout the city, and they would all be activated upon sensing the fall of the main headquarters. If I had struck at their heart, they would try to strike at mine. When I arrived in the neighborhood, the silence felt like a slap in the face. The streets were deserted, but not with the calm of night, rather with the stillness of a cemetery. When I turned the corner where the small brick church stood, my heart stopped. There was no fire, no explosions, but something worse. A red mist, thick and smelling of iron, surrounded the church like a suffocating serpent. The lights on nearby lampposts flickered erratically, and on the ground, dozens of birds lay dead, their wings outstretched toward the unseen pulpit. I jumped out of the car before it came to a complete stop. "Pastor, brothers!" I shouted, running toward the entrance and pushing open the door. The resistance was brutal. It wasn't a physical barrier, but a wall of pure hatred. Inside, I saw the scene that would haunt me for the rest of my days. The congregation was there, but no one was moving. They were all on their knees, their hands clasped, forming a circle of prayer around the pastor. He stood before the altar, his face pale and his hands trembling as he held his Bible. Before them, in the center aisle, was not an entity from the abyss, but something far more twisted. 3 men dressed in impeccable suits, members of the political caste I myself had helped cleanse months before. Their eyes had no pupils, only spheres of aliquid darkness that seemed to overflow their cheeks. "You're just in time for the transfer, Julian," one of them said, his voice like the buzzing of thousands of insects. "You have destroyed the altar of the 5th, so now these saints will pay the debt. 1 life for each broken seal is the law. They have nothing to do with this," I roared, feeling my old violent nature trying to take over. "On the contrary," the second man said, taking a step toward the pastor, "they gave you refuge, they interfered with the flow of the harvest. Now his blood will be the new foundation of our rebuilding." I saw the shepherd begin to suffocate as if invisible hands were squeezing his trachea. The red mist began to condense around the children on the ground. Panic blinded me for a second. I searched within myself for the light that had saved me before, but this time it felt elusive, obscured by the guilt of having brought war to this refuge. "Do not fear, little flock," I heard the shepherd gasp, and despite the pressure on his neck, he looked at me intently. "Greater is he who is in you." His words shook me. The blinder's mistake was always believing that power came from within oneself or from a technique. The authority I carried now, it wasn't a gift to use as I pleased, it was a delegation. I positioned myself between the possessed politicians and the congregation. I opened my arms not to fight like a warrior, but to serve as a shield. "I am the one who broke the pact," I shouted and felt my voice connect with something eternal. "If you seek life, here I am, but this place has been sealed with blood that your masters fear to name. In the name of Jesus Christ, release this temple." The three men let out a laugh that turned into a scream of agony as the name of Jesus echoed off the brick walls. The red mist began to burn, turning white. The politicians fell to the ground writhing as the entities that inhabited them tried to flee the heat of the truth, but the darkness did not surrender so easily. In a final act of malice, the mist concentrated into a single spear of shadow aimed directly at the heart of the pastor's daughter, a little girl who looked at me with eyes filled with tears. I didn't think, I didn't pray, I acted. I threw myself in front of the girl, interposing my own body. I felt the impact of the shadow like an icy stab piercing my chest. The cold was absolute. I felt my soul being sucked into a bottomless void. I fell to the ground, watching the church roof rust as my senses faded. I heard the shouts of the congregation, the girls' cries, and, above all, the roar of frustration from the entities retreating before the light that began to flood the temple. "It's over," I thought, feeling my blood run cold. I have paid the debt. But in the twilight of my dying consciousness, a light brighter than the midday sun enveloped me. There was no pain, only a voice that seemed to rebuild every atom of my being. "No one has greater love than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends. Your death contract has been replaced by a pact of life." I opened my eyes. I was lying in the church aisle. The pastor and his daughter were above me, praying with a fervor that made the air vibrate. The red mist had vanished. The men in suits had fled, leaving only their luxurious jackets on the floor as a trace of their defeat. I sat up, and to my astonishment, there was no physical wound on my chest. The shadow spear had not killed me. I had died in contact with the light that now dwelt within me. "You are safe, Julian," the pastor said, helping me to my feet. "But the entire city has felt this shock. You can no longer hide. The war has emerged from the shadows and is now in the streets." I looked at my hands. They were warm. The traitor's mark had become the redeemed scar. The empire of evil had lost its first major legal battle, and I, the exegete, was now living proof that one's sacrifice can save many. The true harvest was beginning. The air in the small brick church felt electrified, but no longer with the static of fear, but with the vibration of a victory we could barely comprehend. As I stood up, I felt my body was no longer the same. The heaviness that had accompanied me since my consecration at age 7 had completely dissipated. However, the pastor was not celebrating. His gaze was fixed on the street, where the neighborhood silence was beginning to be broken by the sound of sirens and the distant barking of dogs that wouldn't stop howling. "They have crossed a line, Julian," said the pastor, wiping the sweat from his brow as he attempted to sacrifice an innocent person within these walls. "They have invalidated their own legal rights in this territory, but that makes them more dangerous. Now they won't fight with subtlety, they'll fight with rage." He didn't have to finish the sentence. In the darkest corner of the temple, where the lamplight barely reached, the floor began to ooze a thick, black substance. It wasn't oil, it was ectoplasm of rancor, a physical manifestation of the thousands of cries of the victims I, as a reaper, had helped to silence. The sect was using my past against me. "Murderer," whispered a voice that seemed to come from inside my own eardrums. "Your hands smell of us. You cannot be free while our voices cry out for justice." I covered my ears, but the sound was internal. The master, from some hidden place in the city, was opening the Tribunal of Lamentations. It was a forbidden technique that consisted of summoning the spiritual memories of all the people the deserter had harmed so that they would drag him to suicide out of guilt. I watched in horror as blurry faces began to emerge from the black stain, figures of smoke reminiscent of sacrificed animals and, worse still, of the people who lost everything because of the spells I cast. "It's a lie!" I screamed, but my voice sounded hollow. I didn't know, I was just following orders. "Ignorance doesn't absolve you of guilt," Julian hissed, the collective voice of the shadows. "The forgiveness you received at this altar is for your soul, but your actions still echo. Come with us into the void." I felt my feet sink into the ground, which had become as soft as black mud. The congregation began to pray more fervently, but the shadows unleashed a wave of cold that caused several brothers to fall to their knees, shivering. The attack was designed to isolate me. The master knew that my weakest link was remorse. The pastor approached the black stain, but this time he didn't scream. He knelt beside me and forced me to look him in the eyes. "Julian, look at me. The enemy isn't accusing you of something false, he's accusing you of what you actually did. His strategy is the truth without hope. He wants you to believe that Christ's sacrifice wasn't enough to cover your specific sins. There are too many, Pastor," I cried. Feeling shadowy hands pull my jacket toward the depths of the stain. "I killed their peace, I destroyed families." "Exactly," the pastor replied with a firmness that cut through the air, "and that's why the price was so high. Don't fight your memories, Julian. Accept that you are guilty, but declare that the debt has already been paid by another. The Court of Lamentations has no jurisdiction over a man who has died to himself." I closed my eyes. The darkness reached my waist. I felt the cold of the abyss trying to freeze my will. In my mind, I visualized the obsidian dagger with which I performed so many rituals, and in an act of desperate faith, I imagined that dagger breaking not from my strength, but from the weight of a wooden cross. "I am guilty," I whispered into the abyss. "I am the blinder who brought pain. I don't deserve to be here." The shadows let out a triumphant laugh and pulled harder, but I wasn't finished. My score was at 0. I screamed and felt a volcanic heat rise in my throat. "The court of heaven has issued a verdict of innocence by the blood of Jesus." Voices of the past, "Your legal right over my mind has been revoked." Silence. At that moment, something unheard of happened. The black stain on the floor, instead of swallowing me, began to emit a golden light from within. The ectoplasm of resentment transformed into clear water that evaporated before touching the benches. The faces of lament did not disappear with screams, but softened, as if the forgiveness I had received also brought a respite to the memories of my victims. The tribunal dissolved. I lay panting on the floor, drenched in a cold sweat, but with a mental clarity I had never experienced. The master had played his best card, guilt, and had lost. "They no longer have anything to cling to, Julian," said the pastor, helping me to my feet. "You have faced your past and you haven't run away. Now you are truly dangerous. Because a man who no longer has secrets or hidden guilt is invisible to the eyes of the sect." However, looking out the broken window, we saw that the city was changing. The sky was no longer black, but a neon red. In the distance, the main clock tower of the city, a monument I knew to be an obelisk of power for the sect, began to emit a pulse of violet light. "They're summoning the great harvest," I said, recognizing the sign. "Since they couldn't recapture me, they're going to accelerate the plan. They're going to try to collect the entire city's debt tonight." The pastor looked at me with a mixture of respect and urgency. "Then it's time for the Reaper to learn to use the word for life. We can't stay here defending ourselves. We have to go to that tower." The war was no longer in a room or a garden. The entire city was becoming an altar, and I was the only one who knew the secret passages to reach the center of the ritual before the clock struck midnight. We left the church under a sky that seemed otherworldly. The violet pulse emanating from the clock tower in the city center expanded in invisible waves, creating a nauseating, dizzying sensation that stopped people in the streets, confused. The traffic lights flashed a frantic yellow, and the dogs' street children ran in circles. howling at a frequency that only those of us who were awake in spirit could understand. The Master had moved from individual hunting to collective sacrifice. That tower isn't just a clock, Pastor, I said, as we climbed into the vehicle. It's a resonator. The sect built it over an intersection of negative telluric currents. If they manage to complete the pulse at midnight, every person under that violet light will suffer an emotional collapse, suicide, violence, and panic will be unleashed throughout the city. It's the great harvest of pain to feed their entities for another decade. The pastor drove with a calmness that I found almost unnerving given the magnitude of the disaster. Fear is the fuel of that engine, Julian. If we panic, we're giving them the upper hand. How do we get in? There's an access point through the sewer system that connects directly to the basement of the obelisk. I myself carried the pieces of the obsidian altar through there a while ago, 3 years. But it won't be easy. That place is protected by the sleepers. The sleepers were the worst of the sect, men and women who had completely surrendered their will, living in a permanent trance, acting as biological sentinels that attacked any presence that didn't vibrate at the frequency of the abyss. We arrived at the entrance of the tunnel in the industrial zone. The smell of dampness and decay was unbearable, but it was the least of our problems. As we descended, the air became so dense that the flashlight barely managed to cut through the gloom. We walked about 300 meters until we reached a solid iron gate engraved with the symbol of the closed eye. Here it is, I whispered. As soon as I touched the gate, the defense system activated. There were no audible alarms. Human figures dressed in grey rags began to descend from the tunnel ceiling. Their eyes were sewn shut with silver thread and their movements were spasmodic like a spider's. They were sleepers. They didn't scream, only emit a constant hiss through their nostrils. No, don't hurt them, Julian, the pastor warned, raising his Bible. They're not them, they're prisoners in their own bodies. They're going to tear us apart, Pastor. I yelled, as 3 of them lunged at us with inhuman speed. One of the sleepers grabbed my neck with a strength that didn't match his emaciated body. I felt his nails digging into my skin. My hunter instinct screamed at me to break his windpipe, to use the violence I was taught to survive, but when I looked at that burned face, I saw a tear run down his cheek. They were suffering. In the name of Jesus, let him go, the pastor ordered. The authority in his voice froze the sleeper holding me, but the attack didn't stop. 10 more were approaching through the tunnel. I understood that we couldn't force our way through. The sect thrived on confrontation. Pastor, we can't fight them. We have to awaken what remains of their souls, I said, recalling a principle of mercy I was only just beginning to understand. Sing as you did in church. The pastor looked at me, understood, and his voice began to resonate in the sewer tunnel. It wasn't a war hymn. It was a melody of restoration. At first, the sleepers stirred violently, banging their heads against the walls, but as the song filled the space, their movements slowed. The silver thread on their eyelids began to glimmer and fall away as if dissolving. We took advantage of that moment of spiritual confusion to pass through the hatch. On the other side, the scene was Dantean. We were at the base of the obelisk. Enormous copper cables, bathed in what appeared to be fresh blood, climbed the walls toward the clock mechanism. In the center, above a pit of shadows, was the Master. He was no longer the decrepit old man of the previous chapter. Somehow, as the pulse began, it had absorbed energy and looked like a man in the full bloom of his evil. You've arrived in time to see the end, traitor, the Master said, his voice amplified by the tower's metal structure. Every second that passes, 1,000 more souls connect to my network. At midnight, this city will legally belong to me. I looked at the clock. It was 10 minutes to midnight. The violet pulse was now a deafening drone that made my ears bleed. This ends here, I shouted, trying to move forward, but the air in front of him solidified into a barrier of pure hatred. You have no business here, Julian Rio the Master. The sacrifice that keeps this engine running is yours. Don't you understand? Having been consecrated as a child, your desertion created the necessary overload to activate the obelisk. You came to destroy it, but your mere presence here is the final fuel. You are the key that locks the trap. I froze. My desire for justice was being used against me. Every beat of my heart, now brimming with life, was feeding the machine that would destroy the city. The master was right about one thing: in the world of pacts, intention doesn't always override legal consequence. I was caught in the Kidor's paradox. I looked at the pastor for an answer, but he was looking up at the gigantic gears that were beginning to turn to mark midnight. The atmosphere turned icy, and the shadows of the world began to climb up my legs. I was about to unwittingly become the executioner of the entire city. The ticking of the monumental clock above our heads wasn't a sound, it was a hammer blow shaking my organs. It was just minutes before midnight, and the Master's revelation had struck me harder than any physical attack. My own redemption, my return to life, was what was fueling the final frequency. Having been marked from the cradle, my life energy was the pure gold the machinery needed to stabilize the violet pulse. I was trapped in a perfect snare. If I stayed, the city would fall. If I tried to escape, the connection would tighten and accelerate the process. It's the principle of symmetry, Julian, the Master mocked as his hands moved over a bronze and bone console. Your light is now the fuel of my shadow. The more you try to resist, the more energy you generate for the obelisk. You are the perfect sacrifice because you are a sacrifice that doesn't want to be one. The pastor, who until that moment had remained in deep prayerful silence, stepped forward. His presence in that basement was like an oil slick in dirty water. Darkness surrounded him, but it couldn't penetrate him. Julian's light doesn't belong to you, master of lies, the pastor said with supernatural calm. Are you trying to use an authority that has already been revoked? Look at the indicators, the master roared, pointing at the copper wires that glowed with an incandescent purple. The city is already weeping, panic is rising up the wires, the harvest has begun. I looked up, and with my spiritual vision still sensitive, I saw the threads of anguish descending from the city toward the tower. Thousands of people in their beds were having nightmares. Thousands of homes were filling with an inexplicable sadness. Everything converged here, and I was the lightning rod. I felt an extreme weakness, my legs gave way, and I fell to my knees on the cold stone floor. The well of shadows claimed me, sucking my breath away. Pastor, I gasped, you're right, I can feel it. My life is escaping through those wires. I'm becoming what I swore to destroy. Kill me. If I die, the connection is broken. The master let out a triumphant laugh. Even your death would be a blinding tribute. A violent death on this altar would close the circuit forever. There's no way out. The pastor knelt beside me. He didn't look at me with pity, but with the intensity of a general about to reveal the final plan. Julian, listen to me. The enemy uses the law of force, but God uses the law of surrender. He's using your life because you're holding it back out of fear. Fear is the conductor of that electricity, but there's a short circuit he can't handle, the voluntary sacrifice of praise in the midst of agony. What is he talking about? I can't even breathe. Don't fight the suction, the pastor continued, ignoring the teacher's cries. Surrender, but not to him, but to the Father. If your life is no longer yours, he cannot use it as fuel, because the owner has changed. Surrender your right to exist. Give him your last breath, not as payment, but as an offering. The teacher, realizing where the conversation was going, released a burst of will-o'-the-wisp from his hand, but the Bible in the pastor's hand seemed to absorb the impact, creating a shield of white sparks. Shut up, old man. The teacher shouted. Julian, look at me. I am your origin. I am the one who gave you your name. I closed my eyes. The buzzing in my ears was a roar. I visualized myself again as the 7-year-old boy at the marble altar. I saw the dagger, I saw the blood, and then I saw the light of the brick church. I understood. My sin had been believing that my redemption was for my own well-being, to feel good and be safe, but true redemption was becoming a channel for something greater. I am not the key, I whispered, and felt the pressure in my chest reach its breaking point. I'm the incense. With an effort that made my nose bleed, I stopped fighting the shadows that were creeping up my legs. Instead of pushing them away, I opened my heart wide, not to let evil in, but to let out everything God had placed within me during those days of freedom. I began to sing in my mind a wordless melody, an act of pure love for the Creator who had rescued me from the garbage dump. The effect was immediate and violent. The copper wires instead of absorbing my energy, began to emit a sound like shattering glass. The violet frequency collided with the frequency of my surrender. The hatred in the tower could not process the purity of a praise born from pain. The master screamed in terror when he saw that the light rising through the wires was no longer purple, but a blinding golden white. "Stop!" the master shrieked, trying to disconnect the wires with his bare hands. "You're burning the system, you're cleansing the network." The entire tower began to tremble. The obelisk, designed to emit anguish, was now being forced to transmit peace throughout the city through my connection. The threads of sorrow descending from the sky were severed one by one, replaced by a rain of light falling upon the homes. A true reverse atonement was taking place. My voluntary sacrifice was healing what my sin had wounded, but the physical cost was devastating. I felt my heart expand to the point of bursting. My skin began to glow with an unbearable intensity. "Just a little longer, Julian," the pastor shouted, holding me as the basement structure began to give way. "Midnight is here." The clock above struck its first chime. The sound was like thunder that shook the foundations of the earth. The teacher was thrown against the wall by the shockwave of light, his body losing its human form and becoming a heap of shattered shadows. I felt myself fading away, my body turning into pure energy. 11 chimes remained. Each one would be a blow against the sect's empire in the city, but I didn't know if my flesh would withstand the second. I was at the eye of the spiritual hurricane, being consumed so that others could awaken. The second chime of the clock didn't just vibrate in the air, it resonated in the very structure of my being. With each strike of bronze, the white light that erupted from my chest intensified, traveling through the copper wires like a torrent of purifying fire. The master, now reduced to a trembling silhouette of tattered shadows, tried to crawl toward the emergency manual switch, but the basement floor was beginning to glow with an intensity that repelled him like acid. "Impossible," his voice roared, no longer human, but a chorus of 1,000 wails. "No man can bear such glory without disintegrating. You're killing yourself, Julian." "I'm already dead," I managed to speak through gritted teeth. As I felt my bones turn translucent, the Reaper died on the church altar. "What you see now is his." Third chime, fourth chime. Through the nerve connection I still maintained with the tower, I began to see what was happening in the city. The violet pulse, which once injected panic into hearts, had been transmuted by my dedication in the hospitals. Terminally ill patients felt sudden relief. In the alleyways, men holding weapons dropped them, overwhelmed by a wave of repentance that flooded them. The sect's great harvest had become a massive sowing of grace, but the price was being exacted on my flesh. My arms began to crack, releasing beams of light. The pastor who wouldn't let go of me was enveloped in a radiance that made his clothes seem like white linen. He never stopped praying, and his voice was the only anchor keeping me in this world. "Santa, resist, Julian!" the pastor shouted. "The root of evil is being uprooted." At that moment, the basement was flooded with an additional dark presence. From the shadowy pit at the center emerged the other members of the Circle of Seven who remained alive. They didn't come to fight, they came in desperation, for their source of power was being poisoned by the purity of my sacrifice. They rushed at me with daggers and hooks, trying to stop my heart so the flow would be cut off. "Kill the portal," the master howled. "If the portal dies with hatred, the light will go out." An obsidian dagger sank into my left shoulder. I felt no physical pain, I felt a spiritual chill that tried to silence my inner song, but something amazing happened. The blood that flowed from my wound wasn't red, it was gold, and as it fell upon the members of the sect, they recoiled, screaming as if molten metal had been thrown at them. My pain was no longer a weakness, it was a weapon. Seventh chime, eighth chime, the tower began to tilt. The gigantic gears of the clock, forced by the energy I was injecting, began to melt. Liquid metal dripped from the ceiling, but it didn't touch me. It swerved around the circle the pastor and I formed. Julian called me the master, making one last effort to regain his form. "Look at me, we can still rule. Your power is immense now. Don't waste it saving these larvae, use it for yourself." That was the final temptation. For a microsecond, the idea of my own power caressed me. I could use this energy to be a god, to erase my enemies, to reign. But when I looked at the pastor, I saw his face filled with a peace that power could never buy. I saw the image of the girl in the church, and then, with an act of will that hurt more than the dagger in my shoulder, I released the last trace of my ego. 9th toll, 10th toll, it's all yours, I shouted to the invisible sky, completely ignoring the master. A deafening roar shook the entire city. The clock tower obelisk exploded upward, but not into stone rubble, but into a column of light that could be seen for miles around. The violet frequency was completely eradicated from the atmosphere. The master and the members of the circle were absorbed into the well of shadows they themselves had dug, disappearing into the void they had served so well. 11th chime, the basement began to collapse. I felt my soul detach from my body. I was floating above the city, watching as the light finished cleansing the darkest corners. I saw the sect's headquarters in other neighborhoods crumble on their own, their altars shattering from the resonance of the forgiveness I had unleashed. It's over, I thought, closing my eyes as I submerged in a sea of absolute whiteness. One more chime, the 12th. The closing of the cycle, but I no longer felt my body. I stood on the threshold, seeing an open door that radiated a love that cannot be described with human words. I was ready to enter. I had fulfilled my duty. The reaper had delivered his final harvest. However, in the midst of that light, I felt a firm hand grasp my arm. It was the same hand of the pastor. But now it felt stronger, more eternal. Not yet, Julian, whispered a voice that filled the universe. Your story doesn't end at the altar. The testimony is still needed. The 12th chime sounded, but it wasn't a roar. It was perfect silence. A silence that carried with it the scent of fresh rain and the awakening of a city that for the first time in centuries was truly free. When I opened my eyes, the silence was absolute. It wasn't the terrifying emptiness of the abyss, but the deep calm that follows a storm that has cleansed the air. I lay amidst the ruins of the tower, surrounded by stone rubble and fragments of gears that no longer emitted any hum. The violet pulse had been extinguished. Looking up, I saw that the basement ceiling had vanished, allowing me to see the dawn sky. The reddish clouds had dissipated, giving way to a pale, serene blue. The pastor sat a few feet away, his clothes in tatters and his face stained with olin, but with a smile that illuminated the ruins. He came over and helped me to my feet. My hands, once marked by darkness, were clean. The battle scars on the obelisk now shone with a whiteness that denoted healing, not pain. Look, Julian, the pastor said, pointing toward the city. We walked toward what remained of the exit and gazed at the city from the central hill. People were coming out onto their balconies, into the streets, into the parks. There were no screams of terror. They hugged each other, wept with relief, or simply remained silent, breathing air that no longer weighed them down. The master's empire had disintegrated. Without the sustenance of fear and blood pacts, the structure of the sect had vanished like a house of cards in the sunlight. I have died and been reborn twice in less than a week, I whispered, feeling the warmth of the sun on my face. What remains now for a man who was designed to take lives? There remains the sowing, Julian, the pastor replied. The enemy trained you to know his darkest secrets, not so that you would lose yourself in them, but so that today you can guide others toward the way out. The city is free, but the souls need to know why. They need to know that it wasn't a technical failure, but an act of love that broke its chains. We returned to the small brick church. It was no longer the place where I hid, but my home. During the following months, I watched the neighborhood transform. People who once consulted the sect's witch doctors now came to confess their fears and seek the peace they felt at midnight of silence. I, the exegete, sat with them. I didn't speak to them of power or rituals. I spoke to them of the freedom that comes from surrender. My life is no longer a shadow. I work with my hands. I help in the church's soup kitchen, and every night I give thanks for the simple fact that my name is no longer written in a book of shadows, but engraved on the heart of the one who gave his life for mine. I have learned that true authority is not found in controlling others, but in humble service. The dagger contract was replaced by a covenant of grace that has no expiration date. Today I look back and no longer see a monster, but a man who was rescued from the deepest pit to be a sign of hope. The harvest of darkness is over, and in its place, the sowing of a light has begun that nothing, not even the darkest sacrifice, can extinguish. Julian's story reminds us that no matter how deep we have fallen or what pacts we have signed in our ignorance or despair, there is always a way out. Darkness feeds on the lie that it is too late or that your sin is too great, but this exegete's testimony demonstrates that light has no limits when a heart humbles itself with sincerity. Do not seek in the shadows what only the truth can give you. True power does not demand sacrifices because the ultimate sacrifice has already been made by you. If you feel there are chains in your life that don't let you breathe, or if you know someone trapped in the confusion of the occult, like this video so the YouTube algorithm can show it to people who are desperately searching for a way out of the darkness, subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss any of our testimonies. Every week we bring you real stories of people who, like Julian, went from death to life. Share this message right now. It could be God's instrument to break the contract of someone who is losing hope today. Yeah.